Hello and welcome to Project Explain's APCSA video. Today me and Akil are going to be going over arrays and array lists, when to use what, and the differences between both of them, and essentially their functionalities too. And to begin with, we're going to start off with arrays. So arrays are essentially like lists that store data and store values. So for example, I'll declare an array right now, and we're going to go over it. So one thing we can do is string cars equals, we'll just follow what REPL's telling us, and that gives us an array right there. So that is an array. Essentially, it's a string array. It basically collects. So we know the array's name is cars. So like, let's say we had a list, and so the list title was called cars, and this list contains a bunch of strings, where essentially each string is a car brand. So as we can see here, there's Volvo, BMW, Ford, Mazda. I mean, there's of course other car brands, but for the sake of just like keeping it short, we're only going to use four. So a couple things is we noticed that we declare the type of what's in the array with by writing string here with make sure like keep it capital S. Then we declare that it's an array by keeping these brackets here. So that's string array. And then the array name, like I stated previously, is cars, and the strings in the array are these strings over here inside the brackets, separated by a comma. Just like that, we can also make an int string, int array. Int, yeah, we'll follow this, follow REPLs again. Int my num, as we can see here, we have an integer array, as it says int. And don't worry about the fact that it's gray. Gray just means we haven't really used it. REPL said notice that we haven't really used it, but that doesn't really matter for now. So this is essentially declaring an array. It's kind of how an array works. And a couple properties of an array is with an array, once you create this list, you can't add more values. You can't like, for example, my cars list, I can't add Porsche to this list anymore. I could replace Porsche, I could replace like one of the car brands in this list with Porsche. For example, I could replace Mazda with Porsche. However, I would not be able to add another string named Portia. Or I could also not delete a string. Like I don't have the option to do that with an array. That it's possible to do that with an array list, but not an array. And we'll get to that later. So some functions with the array, uh, some functions with the array that might be useful to know are are essentially array length, indexing, looping through arrays, and traversing arrays. So to begin with, we're going to learn about array length. And so as we can see here, this car's list has a list of array length of 4. So the method to finding the length of an array is cars dot length. However, we can't just leave it alone like that. We can see that that's true by printing it out. So we do system.println cars dot length, and now let's run the code. Should be getting 4, unless there's a bug in our code. And there you go, 4. So that's that. That's the cars out length. If we change this originally, we add Ferrari and try this again. What would we get? We would get probably 5, I would hope. And we get 5. There we go. And the same thing with this array list. If we just change this to my num, notice how there's 4 in this list, so we'll just it should be giving us 4, and we'll wait. Oh, there's an error. It's a typo. There we go. And now let's try. We should get 4. There we go, 4. So that's array length. Next, we're going to go into array indexing. And this is where we can get into like editing the strings or editing the numbers that are in each position. So for example, indexing just means accessing each string essentially, or accessing each like data type inside the list or inside the array. For example, if we want to access the first term on my num, which would be 10, we would do we'll just do another system.println. We'll do my num, and then we'll do brackets 0. So let's delete this actually, and then we'll show how that works. And that should give us 10. And I'll go over the line exactly in a second once the output comes. Exactly 10. So we notice my num, that's the array name, right? Then we have these brackets. These brackets essentially help us index. So 0 is always the first term. This is very important to remember. 0 is always the first term. So this 10 is 0. The 20 is 1. The 30 is 2. The 40 would be indexed with 3. So for example, if I do system.out.print ln my num 3, I should be getting 40. In fact, that's exactly what I'm going to get unless I have a bug. And there we go, 40. Where does a D come from? Not too sure, but that's the 40 right there. So that's how you would access mynum, the fourth term on mynum with 3 instead of 4. So now let's talk about indexing through. Let's traversing through an array, really to find each to really be able to access each point through a loop, like for loop. So the way to do that, the most basic way to do that would be to do for int I equals 0. We're gonna start off with I, and we're gonna do this with a cars length. So cars dot length I plus plus. Very simple. We'll just do this, and we'll delete these two really quickly. So now let's run this. While it's running, I'll explain what's going on. So for int I equals 0, basically means that we're essentially I is a counter variable. It's just counting up by 1. That can be noted, that can be seen as with this I plus plus. So I starts out with 0, then each iteration it prints cars I. So it starts out with 0, cars 0, prints car 0. Then I plus plus means I plus 1. So I goes to 1, then prints cars 1. Then I plus 1 again, so I is 2. Then it cars 2. But when does it stop? It stops when it does not pass this condition. This is a condition we have placed. As long as I is less than cars.length, and remember cars.length is 4 in this case, or 5 actually in this case. As long as the I is less than cars.length, which is 5, then this list will keep running. So we'll go from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. That's how far I will go, because I cannot be 5. Therefore, we will access a 0, which is Volvo, as you can see down here. 0 is Volvo, 1 is BMW, 2 is Ford, 3 is Mazda, 4 is Ferrari. So that's a for loop. Another way to traverse through an array would be a for each loop. So a for each loop would essentially just be string I cars. And essentially what we're doing here is um, so if you see here, we have a for loop, the same for loop, but it's a for each loop. The string I essentially means each string is going to be called I as we pass on through this array called cars that we defined up here. So each is I, and this goes over all of I, all the strings on the cars list, and so it prints each and every single one of them. And so if you press, let's just delete this. If we press run, we should be getting what we need to get, and that is the same list. There we go. It's the same list. Now let's say, oops. Okay, now let's say, for the with this for loop, let's say we only want to access BMW through Mazda. We don't want to access Volvo or Ferrari. How would we do that? Well, then we would skip the 0th term, which is Volvo, and we would start with the first term, which is BMW. And so that means we have I at 1. And we also want to skip, we don't want to have Ferrari in our, we don't want to print out Ferrari. We want to stop at Mazda. So what we can do is we can have I is less than car's length minus 1. Car's dot length is 5. Car's dot length minus 1 is 4. And if I cannot be greater than 4, I cannot be 4, then I can never, then we can never reach car's 4, which is Ferrari, essentially. So therefore, we will stop at Mazda. And now if we print this out, we should get BMW, Ford, Mazda. Only those three cars. And now we wait. There we go, BMW, Ford, Mazda. And those are the main things you need to know for. Actually, there is one more thing that you might want to know for arrays before we move on to array lists. That is essentially editing the string values essentially. So let's say we wrote down BMW, but we want to change this to Mercedes. So one thing we can just do is treat it like a normal variable. So we just write cars and then we write brackets. And since BMW is the first term, we write 1. Remember, it's the first term, not the second term, the first term. And so we put inside the brackets, we put 1. And that equals the new string will put Mercedes. And that's it. Now we've just changed cars 1. So now if we go back to that for loop we had, we have we just do this for loop again. Instead of seeing BMW, we should see Mercedes. And after that, we should be good with arrays. There we go. All right, so I'll let Akil take over for array lists.
Okay. Yeah. So array lists basically have the same function as arrays, which is just to like store a certain data type. But the main reason why you would use an array list instead of an array is when you don't know this exact size the array is going to be. For example, like in the one above here, we know that like the length of strings cars will always be 5, and the length can never be changed. But with an array list, you can change the size of the array list, and that's the main use you're going to use in the whenever using in the AP exam. So initially, the first thing you want to do when you're trying to create an array list is to import it. It's not like built in like an array, so you would have to start off with saying import java.util.arraylist. And the initialization of an array list is also a bit different, but it's fairly simple. It start off with array list, and then now in these two like arrows, it would be the data type. And for now, we'll use integer. And then now we can choose the name of our array list, which will go with my numbers. And equals new array list, and then the same integer data type. Notice how here in the array list, you don't have to initialize the size or like the whatever is going to be in the array list because you'll do that in the future. So the basic, there's instead of like in arrays, there's no methods really. And but for array list, there's going to be methods to add, remove to get the size of the array list. And that's where it differs from arrays. So we'll go off with the most basic method of an array list, which is the size method. And that would just be, um, we'll say my numbers dot size. And this, unlike an array, you'll actually have to use the open and close parentheses because you're actually calling a method. And if we try it right now, it should print 0 because the length of the array list is 0. Array list. Um, oh, is it capitalization? Oops. Yeah, there we go. So it should print out 0. And while we're waiting, we can also add, yeah, it's 0 right here. So we can now all add numbers into our array list. And it's again fairly simple. My numbers dot add, and then we can start off with 10. And if you don't, so there's two components into the add methods, two parameters. The first one would be the index number. And so right now, if I put it 0, that means I'm inserting in the beginning. And the second one is the value you're giving to the new array list. But if I don't include anything in as my first parameter and just include one, like the number 20 here, it'll automatically add it to the end. So if we want to test it out and I print the array list, we should see 10 and 20. Yep, there we go. Okay, so another method for the array list would be dot remove, and this is simple. And unlike an array, you can actually remove values. So this is where it's like you see a benefit from the array list as 7 array. So my numbers dot remove, and this time you're using the index number instead of any type of value. So say I want to remove 20, I wouldn't type 20 here, but instead I'll type which index it is, which is it's 1. And now we can try printing out the array again, array list, and we'll notice that it'll just be 10. Yep, we see 10 right here. And now we'll move on to traversing the array list, and it's basically the same as arrays. And you can go by two different ways. One is using the basic for loop, which would be I is less than my numbers dot size. And unlike an array, actual array, you'd use dot size method instead of dot length, but everything else would be the same. And to get the value of the array list based on the index, we'd call the get method. And it's also fairly simple, and you'd use the index to get the value. So for this, we'll remove this. And we should get add extra. And while it's waiting to print, the more common method used with array list would use the for each loop, and it's the exact same as the arrays, except you just changed my numbers here. And as we can see, as the earlier print, it printed out 10 and 20 just like that. Let's see. And that's pretty much it for array lists. It just in most cases you'd use arrays, especially on the AP exam. But the only time you'd really want to use an array list is when you don't know the size of the array or of the list. So you would say, we can go an example here. Say you want only values in a certain array that is less than 25. You can't create an array to do that because you don't know just yet how much values that is. But for an array list, you can start off by just initializing my numbers here. And based on that, you can either add numbers and add or remove numbers to get to the your data. And yep, that's pretty much it for arrays and array lists. Do you want to add anything else?
Uh, no, I don't think we need to add anything else. That's pretty much it for arrays and array lists. Just remember a couple things that arrays, this is probably not gonna show up in your AP test, but arrays are always more efficient than array lists, and that's why arrays exist, and that's why you don't always use array lists.